Well, welcome everyone to, we haven't got any attendees except ourselves. Got one, they're coming in. We might give them a couple of minutes to join because a number will have been coming from the membership meeting. So just wait a few moments. For those of you who are just joining us, we're just waiting for a few moments while others come. We'll just give it another minute or so and then we'll start. So even though I can see the names of two Janets, I gather one Janet must be Megan. Okay. I think you're very clever that you can actually put one name up on two screens. I wouldn't be able to do it. Okay, well, a number have joined us and our session has started, so I think we should get underway. We've got 5 papers that will be presented for this session titled Corporate Power and Regulation. And the first paper is by Ricardo, and I should add for the audience, we're in 3 different time zones, so please bear with us. Ricardo, at the moment, it's about 4:45 a.m. for him. So he will present the first paper, Corporate Planning and Innovation in the Context of Economic Reform, the case of Alibaba. Thank you, Ricardo.
Okay, thank you, Len. I shared the window already, right? Yeah. Okay, good. Good afternoon, everyone. The study that I want to share with you in this section is corporate planning and innovation in an economic reform context, the case of Alibaba. And this is part of a series of my study on China's economic reform and development and its construction of a social market economy. And this is the outline of my paper. I firstly identify the research question and the methods. Then I put together a simple and realistic analytical framework to show the contextual dimensions for the state of corporate planning and the power. And based on this study, I scrutinized the specific evidence from the process of China's economic reform to explicate the domain for the incorporation of Alibaba and its dramatic growth to become a global e-commerce conglomerate. And parallel to the rapid growth of the ability to plan and innovate, I also recap this tug of war with the public planning. And in the economic reform context, I also show that the active role taken by the Chinese government served as the ultimate force to narrow down the expanding gaps between the public planning and the Alibaba's corporate planning. Now, to start with, my basic inquiries are that while the planning and innovation are necessary for the corporation to plan and sustain their power, how would they actually plan and innovate? And why do their behavior vary over time and across different societies? The response to these questions will definitely widen our understanding of the studies of Galbraith, Douglas, and the related institutionalists in an international context. For example, as indicated by Douglas, corporation is an instrument of economic planning. And in this case, what would be the specific representation of this institution in economic reform context in China, and what could be revealed from the growth of the corporation like Alibaba. These are to be examined in this paper. And to employ a realistic base for the study, some guidelines under the historical methods as stressed by Hoxie are followed to uncover the way the corporation planned and innovate in a specific context of China. And overall speaking, these are the three guidelines that I will follow to explore the case in Alibaba in China. And I will explain them in more detail in another slides. And after a comprehensive review of the related literature, this is the general framework that I put together to explore the domains for corporations to plan and to innovate. In the real world, I found that corporations that plan and innovate effectively usually demonstrate their ability to master and manipulate three interrelated and interactive contextual dimensions in a society. And these three dimensions are including, for example, the government and political party, the community, and the technology. And in the process of growth, the entrepreneurship and functioning of a right technostructure actually enhance a corporation's social and market power. Despite the common elements that I present in this general framework, although they are the same, okay, in different kinds of the study, government, community, and technology, their interaction with the corporate planning and innovation are dynamic over time actually, and they are specific to the historical progress of different societies. Based on this framework, and by referring to the three guidelines of the historical methods that I just mentioned, the definite problem to this study is, of course, to examine the expansion of the corporate power of Alibaba in the specific contextual settings in China, which is evidently different from different countries, for example, different from the United States of America, and to explain how the situation comes to what it is, the growth of Alibaba in a bigger picture of China's public planning for economic reform has to be uncovered. And also, this will be different from the growth process of the Amazon or eBay that we know. And lastly, to review about how Alibaba realized its corporate planning and innovation, and hence to expand its corporate power. The specific and select evidence are derived from China's economic reform context for the analysis. And based on the historical evidence, I show that the incorporation of Alibaba in 1999 was actually representing a crucial stage in China's economic reform process. And following the change in the social fabric in the first 2 decades of China's economic reform, which I will show in another slide, the Chinese government made a very important decision in 1998 to largely privatize the state-owned enterprise and also approve the incorporation of the private enterprise as the vehicles to expedite the country's economic reform. So that this led to actually the incorporation of the Alibaba. And in this case, the approval by the Chinese government for the private corporation by that time was actually part of the public planning to achieve several goals. Firstly, it is to lower the unemployment pressure in the group of the university graduate, and to also facilitate the internal consumption. And then lastly is to raise the living quality of the community. And being part of the instrument of the public planning, the dramatic growth of Alibaba to outbid other corporate endeavors could be directly attributed to the entrepreneurship of its founders and the establishment of an effective technostructure which fit into the specific social fabrics and its change under the economic reform domain by that time. Indeed, the evidence showed that the expansion of Alibaba's corporate power is derived from its planning ability to carry out the new combination in the trade of consumer goods through online transaction, and also its succeed to have the community to understand the latent needs for the goods when their incomes are increasing, especially in the rural area. And on top of a large volume of literal evidence that are reviewed, this finding I just presented to you can also be supported by some key quantitative facts. Okay, for example, as presented in this table, we can see that the social landscape of China under the economic reform context changed rapidly in terms of the advancement in the education, infrastructure, technology, per capita income in both of the urban and the rural area. And I also recap the numbers in 1999 in between of the economic reform and the latest number, because 1999 was the year of the incorporation of Alibaba. Under this domain, I then explicitate Alibaba's planning and innovation in figure 2. And in this figure, as aforementioned, following the rapid expansion of the higher education in the community, it is the public planning to encourage the university graduate to launch their own business. Thus, the corporate planning of Alibaba indeed link up millions of the individual online shop and the consumer product producers, and to make use of Alibaba's very well-known Taobao and Tmall platforms to achieve a progressive network effect for the online trade of the consumer goods. And through the corporation's technostructure, and we can identify that Alibaba can successfully make use of the advancement of the country's internet and the mobile technology as already invest and expand by the country as a whole, okay, to promote the information flow for a wide range of variety of consumer goods and products from the producer and the online shops to the potential consumers, as well as its ability to have the communities understanding their latent needs for the goods and to improve their quality of life, as shown in the top of these figures, that their income has been increased. So that this is actually a process to meet the Chinese government's public planning as a whole in the economic reform process. For those transactions on the internet, then we have to understand that to complete the transaction of a huge volume of the online trade of the consumer product, it is actually also supported by the government's simultaneously in its public planning, okay, for the increasing investment in the country's infrastructure in terms of the expansion of the highway and high railway system. In this case, the transaction of the physical product for the delivery can be improved, so that also the business volume and the turnover of Alibaba and the whole system of the this online trade can be expanded over time. And another key to the success of Alibaba in expanding its corporate power is indeed derived from the establishment of its online payment platform, the Alipay from 2004, which does not only provide a specific protection to both buyers and sellers engaged in the online trade under the particular social setting in China's social setting, but also allows Alibaba to further develop its e-commerce business as a conglomerate and raise its ability to transcend the boundary of public planning of the economic reform. And then now, following the rapid growth of the corporate power, especially through Alibaba's ability to promote the Chinese online purchase culture. This is a new culture actually in the Chinese community after that. And the wide application of the Alipay. Alibaba's further expansion to the online finance business through the establishment of an affiliate corporation, the Ant Financial Group, okay, in 2014, which is based on the Alipay, clearly transcends the expected road under the public planning for economic reform. In particular, the business conducted by Ant Financial Group clearly involved the shadow banking activities. For example, although Alibaba is not a bank and it is not supposed to take deposit from the general public, it is well known that Alipay offers interest with a higher premium than the market rate on the idle balance of its account and its customers' account. And in addition, online microfinance also provided by the SME to the SME which are affiliated to the Alibaba's group. And while it is reported that over 1 billion and 80 million of merchants has been networked to the mobile apps of Alibaba by 2020, a world record of the 34.5 billion IPO was arranged by the Ant groups simultaneously in this year, in last year, I should say now, okay, last year, despite the government's open questioning about the appropriateness of this expansion. Nevertheless, in this economic reform context, we have to understand that Alibaba is actually a product, a vehicle in the beginning generated and approved by the Chinese government, so that in an economic reform context, an active role taken by the Chinese government becomes the ultimate force to narrow the expanding gaps of Alibaba's corporate planning and the government's public planning. Despite the lack of related regulations in details, the Ant Group's IPO was finally suspended after the top Alibaba management members were summoned and interviewed by the Chinese regulator. And to conclude, the case of Alibaba that I've just presented in this study reinforce our understanding that there are three different aspects from this study. First, if we want to explicitate how a corporation may realize its ability to plan and innovate, it is necessary to review the process through which it integrates effectively with the specific setting and changing social fabric in a particular society. The corporate power in expansion in Alibaba, of course, will very different when I study Galbraith's New Industrial Stage, that book. And this is very different from the case of in United States after World War II, as well as those big corporations also in Europe. And second, we have to understand that to ensure the growing private planning that can be turned into the public purpose, there must be an equal growth in the public planning also. And lastly, very clear in the economic reform context of China, the government may take an effective and active role to manage the practice of the corporate planning and lower the likelihood that corporate power will grow into an unchecked menace. This has been discussed widely by Douglas literature in the past. And then finally, what I want to point out is also that from my study here, the approach that I follow to review the corporate power expansion and the government's interaction with the private corporations planning may indeed illustrate an important argument in the methods of the institutional economics that if the institutionalism had a general theory, it would be a general theory indicating how to develop specific and varied analysis of specific phenomena. So that these are all about my presentation for this short study. And I welcome all any comment and suggestion and criticism to improve this study in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo. Well done. And just a reminder to those attending this session, you may ask questions in the Q&A and we will address all those questions at the end of the 5 presentations. But we really encourage you to pop the questions in the Q&A for each of the presenters. So now our second presentation is Geoff Schneider, The Modern Food Industry in the United States, a case study of industrial sabotage. Thanks, Geoff.
Good afternoon, everybody, or depending on what time zone you are, good evening or good morning. Or can everybody see the screen okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so I've been working on the modern food industry lately. It's sort of a labor of love in that my grandfather was a farmer and I spent a lot of summers on my grandfather's farm when I was growing up. And I wrote this paper and started studying the industry because I am stunned with the degree to which the industry has changed since I was a child, and not in a positive way. So the US food industry has changed in what I would say a very negative way. And it follows the financial interests that we've seen dominate other sectors in that the focus is on making money as opposed to making quality goods. And so, this theme that Veblen highlighted so long ago is increasingly prevalent in both agriculture and in food manufacturing. So we see the industrial sabotage of large agriculture. We see increasing monopoly power in farming, where fewer and fewer interests are now buying up and controlling larger and larger amounts of US farmland, including one of the largest landowners in the United States is Monsanto, the big agribusiness company, which has of course now been bought by Bayer, the German chemical company. But even so, they own a massive amount of farmland. And they also monopolize farm inputs. Bayer and Monsanto together monopolize most of the herbicides and pesticides that they sell to the farms that they now own, right? So it's striking. It's also striking the extent to which this process has been supported by US government. So you have both the US Department of Agriculture and the Food and Drug Administration allowing this to happen, even facilitating it, where you have the revolving door where industry people go back and forth, and you have basically lobbyists writing legislation. In fact, lobbyists write the farm bill and then it's rubber stamped by Congress. And then you have huge agricultural subsidies, but even though the subsidies, they pay lip service to them going to family farmers, actually go to big industry like Bayer / Monsanto. So that's on the food production side. And then the food itself, big food, the manufacturers of food are also doing disturbing things. A lot of the food that they produce is flavorless, unhealthy, and inexpensive. So it is inexpensive, but it's not good for us, and it's also unsustainably produced, as I will discuss. And the other thing is they take all of these commodities and they shape them into ultra processed, what Michael Pollan calls food-like items, right? Ultra processed food. It's not really food. That new evidence places at the root of the obesity crisis in the United States, which is now spreading to other countries. So let me start by just briefly talking about the dramatic changes in farming over the last 170 years, but especially since World War II. Basically, 70 years ago, most Americans got their food from small markets, and those small markets got their food from local farms. And that is just no longer true. Your supermarket gets food from all over the world produced by large agribusiness. And so we see, of course, the dramatic drop in the number of farms as family farmers have gone out of business and been bought up by the huge conglomerates, and the size of farms, of course, going up in response. And so this mirrors other shifts in the economy. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised by that. But it is interesting to think about the fact that the family farm is now basically a thing of the past. So in 2019, 4% of the farms owned a quarter of farmland. They had average sales of more than $1 million. That's not a family farm, right? And their average size was more than 2,900 acres. In fact, most farms in the Midwest and Midwestern states are now 10,000 acres and owned by a large conglomerate. What's interesting is the idea of the farmer being connected to animals and land. That's what we think of when we think of a farmer. But as is so often the case with industrialization and mechanization, you have the alienation of farmers from nature. They no longer work with nature. They sit in a machine all day long and for very low pay, work for somebody else. So, we have specialized low-wage labor utilizing heavy machinery, which of course is the whole process of specialization and de-skilling that has been central to the expansion of manufacturing into new industries. And we have monocultures because if you're going to use heavy machinery, you don't want to grow complicated, ecologically sound, sophisticated systems that fertilize each other. You want to grow one thing where you can drop one set of pesticides on it and one set of herbicides. So the industrialization process goes hand in hand with monoculture. It goes hand in hand with the use of nitrogen fertilizer, which is derived from petroleum products and therefore contributes to global warming. Pests love when one crop is grown in one place, right? It's the perfect environment for pests who love that crop. So you have to use pesticides when you do this. And to make it simpler, you use herbicides as well. And of course, that means you're using GMO crops that have been designed specifically to resist the herbicides. So we're talking about Roundup resistant crops, Roundup and now dicamba. We had to switch to dicamba in a lot of crops now because Roundup has stopped working because, funny thing, the weeds have developed resistance to it. So now we switch to dicamba, which is much more toxic. But of course, there's already dicamba resistant weeds. So that's our future, is what's more toxic than that we switch to. In the interim, basically, we're seeing very little or no attention paid to soil health and to the environment. So when we talk about sustainability, most people do not realize how bad the problem is. The IPCC estimates agriculture contributes anywhere from 21 to as much as 37% of total greenhouse gases. In other words, this industry is absolutely horrible for when it comes to climate change. And specifically, this is driven by nitrogen fertilizer production, which is of course a petroleum product, but also things like the destruction of forests, the use of heavy machinery, shipping food from around the world instead of getting it from your local farm, methane production from huge cattle feedlots, but also from rice production. And then when you do industrial farming, you get reductions in carbon sequestration in the soil, which also contributes to global warming. We're having terrible problems with soil now and soil productivity because of the monoculture and because of the huge size of these corporate farms. So we're getting huge amounts of topsoil washing away. And it now takes about 10 years, about a decade, for land to recover from industrial practices, which tells you something about the destructive nature of industrial agriculture. And we're potentially leading ourselves to crises because we're killing the beneficial insects that we need to produce food, especially pollinators like bees and butterflies. Meanwhile, in the human population, we have increasing toxicity. There are cancer rates that have been directly tied to glyphosate. You've probably seen ads recently to sign on to Roundup lawsuits, right? And dicamba has long been linked to cancer. There's new research that shows that celiac and gluten intolerance are both tied to Roundup and GMO crops. So, the industrial products that are coming out of this are actually quite toxic for a large number of people. Many people are, I think, familiar with the problems with the US meat production, which is why the EU currently bans it. I mean, each year 100 Americans die from E. coli and 420 from salmonella, mostly due to industrial meat. The fact that we have to wash our industrial meat with bleach tells us something about the health conditions in our meat production facilities. Companies to drive profits are emphasizing weight gain and volume, of course, because you need poundage to maximize your profits. which leads to some bizarre things. We have bred chickens in this country so that, and I love this stat, if humans grew as fast as chickens or broilers, a 6.6 pound newborn baby would weigh 660 pounds after 2 months. That's how fast a chicken grows. But of course they feed it terrible high fat food, which includes chickens in it. So chickens are eating chickens. And so what's left out is you have very unhealthy meat. So this kind of meat contains higher fat content and less nutrients. It also weirdly has less flavor. So if any of you remember what a chicken used to taste like when it wasn't produced on a factory farm, it actually had flavor, whereas chickens produced under these mass production techniques don't actually have very much flavor. And that's, of course, all not to mention the animal well-being in this process. So what do we get out of this? We're getting cheap meat, because the price of meat has fallen to about a quarter of what it used to be, but we're getting massive disease outbreaks in all sorts of different areas. Most people don't realize how poor the quality of nutrition in vegetables has become with these same processes. So again, vegetables are now selected for volume of production, but also for things like sturdiness in shipping, long shelf life, and cosmetic appearance. So they're not actually bred for flavor or for texture or for nutritional value. So some scientific studies recently identified that there has been a 6 to 38% decline in vitamins and minerals in our vegetables with the industrialization of food. And over here in the picture, we have, those are farm fresh tomatoes in the United States. They're picked green, and then they're shipped thousands of miles, and then they're ripened with ethylene gas, so they look like they're a ripe tomato, but of course they aren't. And anybody who's had an actual homegrown tomato compared with what they sell in the store knows what that difference is. And we see the same thing in flavorless strawberries and mealy apples and so on. Ultra-processed foods are the other thing that we're seeing that's dramatic in the food industry. Ultra-processed foods, or UPFs, primarily consist of rearrangements of high fructose corn syrup, soybean oil, rice, and wheat, which just happen to be the commodities most subsidized in the US Farm Bill. And what you do is you take those ingredients and you rearrange them and you flavor them with salt and flavorings, and then you dump a bunch of salt, sugar, and fat on them. And then all of a sudden you have a product that will last forever and is very cheap to produce, but of course is extremely unhealthy. Thanks, Lynn. So, all right, here's a weird thing. Processed foods now dominate the American diet. 57.5% of American calories are ultra-processed foods. So this is how most people are eating in the modern US. But these foods contain less protein, less fiber, less vitamins and minerals, more sugars, carbs, and saturated fats. There's a very, very powerful study that came out within the last year from the National Institutes of Health. They basically gave two different groups of people a processed food diet and a whole food diet, and the diets had actually the same nutrition profiles, the same calories, the same fiber, and so on. But one was processed foods like macaroni and cheese, and the other was whole foods. And what they found is people eating the processed foods ate more, consumed more calories, and gained on average 1 pound a week. And when they switched the whole food diet, they lost the pound that they gained. So, basically what we have is conclusive scientific evidence that people tend to eat more when they eat processed foods and they eat more calories. And a lot of that seems to be the fact that these foods are designed to be irresistible so that you want to eat more of them. There are some other studies that have found significant links as well between ultra-processed foods and being overweight. And I won't review it here, but obesity is the leading cause of heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and certain kinds of cancer. So this is a real health epidemic in the United States at this point. So here's where the profit motive becomes insidious. There's literally the food manufacturing companies that make this stuff talk about the need to maximize stomach share, right? They got to get people to eat more stuff. And, they play on the evolutionary process. Scientists think that we have been wired by our evolution to stock up on food when it's when it's plentiful. So we crave sugar, fat, and high calorie foods. Correspondingly, we've now figured out that when we diet, your body tells you that a famine is happening and it lowers your metabolism so that you don't starve. So, you know, there's certain parts of our bodies that don't work very well with this process. And so what the companies have been manipulating to make what they call hyperpalatable UPFs, which are things that are irresistible and literally sort of dissolve in your mouth, are the first thing is they add sugar to everything. So in the store, yogurt and spaghetti sauce have more sugar in them than ice cream. They add fat to everything. I don't know if you know this, but fast food companies add extra fat to the meat so that it has even more fat than it would normally have. McDonald's burgers at one point were 50% fat. They actually, then there was an uproar when people found out that they were adding extra fat to their burgers. And so they're now back to 70% fat, or lean, 30% fat, but still. And they try and manipulate things so that they hit the bliss point, which is where things pique your taste buds enough to be alluring, but don't have an overriding flavor that would tell you to stop eating. So again, designed to get you to consume as much as possible. And another weird thing, they're adding flavor to everything now. Raw meat, butter, vegetables, fruits. They inject flavoring so that you'll consume more of it. They also try and achieve something called vanishing caloric density, where things dissolve in your mouth. So your body tells you didn't really eat anything, even though of course you did. And this is the classic thing with something like a Cheeto or potato chips. They lie about the health content of food. Like they'll take a study that says corn oil is better for you than lard. And they'll say, well, our product contains corn oil, therefore it's good for you, right? Even industrial organic food is not particularly good for you because they're basically concentrating natural toxins. So just as one example, a natural flavoring might be vanilla from pine cones, but eating pine cones isn't really good for you, right? So, you know, this whole idea of natural flavorings, if you see something in the supermarket with natural flavorings, it's not good for you, right? Anything artificial that's not whole foods is manipulated like this. So in general, then, what are we getting from our free market for food? We're getting poor quality, unsafe products. We're getting obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, and we're getting climate change, and we're getting devastation of rural farming communities. I don't have time to do much with alternatives, but I just want to point out that Polanyi's point, I think, is a good one, which is that social progress occurs when coalitions form within communities. And we're starting to see this as communities demand change. We're seeing especially things like community supported agriculture, where you can get all of your vegetables and meats from local farms that are networked. And also we have places like El Creek Cafe in Milltime down the road, where they made a local food cooperative and restaurant the center of their town's life. And they brought in music and it really rejuvenated their downtown. So, you know, I think there are alternatives out there, but it involves fighting against the essence of the industry, which has led to a very unhealthy direction for American food. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. That was great. And I apologise in advance, but I have two puppies that like to get into my study and they're banging on my door. So if the door behind me suddenly bursts open, it's because the dog's trying to come in. So now we'll go to our third presentation. Wilfred will present on behalf of him and his co-authors. And the title's changed a little bit from the program, but I'll leave it over to Wilfred to take us through it. Thanks, Wilfred.
Is this visible to you all?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
All right. So I think it's not on the presentation mode, but I'll proceed anyway. So this is a joint work with my two colleagues from Wageningen University Research, Gohar Isakhanyan and Sjaak Wolfert. I've just learned from Gohar that she is one of the attendees, but she's not listed. So maybe there's something going on there that the ASSA colleague can look into. Yeah, this paper really follows nicely on Jeff's story. While I agree fully with what Jeff has to say about the current situation for what I call the agri-food industry, for want of another word. At the same time, we cannot do without that industry. I mean, we are 7.5 billion people in the world in 2018. And if we want to feed all of those, I think it's going to be quite difficult to rely on local initiatives with an urbanization degree of over 50%. I think we need something else as well. I'm not saying the other, the local initiatives should go. I'm just saying we need more, unless we want really drastic solutions. So what we're doing in this paper is we draw on some work that we've done at Wageningen University to look at how the use of IT, information technology, can help both maintain and even increase scale of production, but at the same time reduce the kinds of footprints that Jeff talked about. Not just on human health, but also on animal health and on the environment and on climate. That needs to change. So basically, agri-food is at the center of what it means to make this, the Sustainable Development Goals, of meeting those. And there needs to be a change in agri-food. And there's, I think, two ways in which to go. One is to change the types of products that you want to produce as from agri-food. So that means GMO, but at least in the EU, we're not very much in favor of that. The other way is to change the production process, and then in the production process, I think the way forward is to use IT. I'll have a very elaborate illustration of that later on, of wine production. We're seeing that agri-food is increasingly high tech, moving towards what some people call agri-tech, ag-tech. At the same time, that move is not as quick as one would hope or expect, because implementation of IT proves hard. Why? Well, I think what you need to look at is a more conceptual point. So this paper makes actually a conceptual point, which is that the supply chain of agri-food has been looked at as the sequential steps of moving goods from primary production to processing, to distribution, to consumption, and that's where this picture comes in. It's more looking at the steps that the products move through. But I think the institutionalist and the strategic view is that at each of those steps, players interact, information is exchanged. And so the suggestion in this paper is that we need to look at the supply chain as a system in which information is exchanged between parties at all the different steps in that chain. So, and then of course, institutional economists know that the provision and also the understanding of information is institutionalized. That's where we come in, but also the exchange of information is a fundamentally strategic one. So you shouldn't look at the way in which goods are being transferred from stage to stage, from player to player, as only operational, logistical steps. There's people positioning themselves, and therefore I've been looking. We discussed a little bit the economics literature on information and markets. And of course, the first two of the four sub-bullets are readily acknowledged in the mainstream, right? There's a market for information that's out there since at least Akerlof. There's also some discussion from North, etc. onwards about the information that is supporting the function of markets. But then, so strategic literature and also institutional literature would say that there's also information available on how markets function, and who has that information will create a more dominant position. And a fourth one is that there's information about how markets function. That's important. So how the information is presented will actually impact the way in which markets function. So there's a favorite example of mine that I will bore you with a little bit. And some of you know that I've been having entertainment and an interest in the music industry. So when the music industry changed from Billboard to SoundScan, the same information, the same music was being sold, but now the sales were not just recorded from the record stores, but from all companies, including the Walmarts of the US, etc. And suddenly you could start to compare sub-markets, and you could start to see also a change in dynamics of the music industry. So how the information is collected, how it is presented to players, has an impact on market dynamics. So that's a fourth way in which information markets interact conceptually. So now comes the big step, but we've created a picture, so hopefully that makes it a little bit easier. So this is this picture requires some explanation. This is a stylized picture of the supply chain, where this is the breadth of the supply chain, and each supply chain, of course, can have at each stage a number of different players, different players competing with each other. Then, of course, this line here is the line that separates one stage from the next. But of course, some players can decide to do some additional activities. Some players can decide to do fewer activities. So actually, this is this indicates that different players can decide to have different extents of outsourcing. And the easy picture of supply chains has a straight line. So no strategic choices of how much to do yourself and how much to have other people do. And then there are potentially, in this stage, this color and lining indicates that that's the same firm, right? So here you have one firm that's actually covering almost half of that stage in the supply chain. Here you have one firm here that covers a third. And so I think this is hopefully enough for me to move to the next step, where the picture comes in again here. But I'm now trying to make the point that if you look at the supply chain as a system in which at each stage there's information being exchanged between different parties, then you can also see how parties make strategic decisions about how to behave and how to interact with their maybe buyers or suppliers. And this hopefully will allow us to make a little bit clearer what happens when you change the supply chain to make more extensive use of, for instance, IT to make this supply chain of agri-food much more sustainable. So, for instance, and don't start with the A. I'll change that in the picture afterwards and in the text. This has been some ongoing work, and with Corona, COVID kind of situations, we've had to make do with whatever time we had left for research. Anyway, so if you have at each stage more players, then the interaction of a player in the next stage with players in the previous stage becomes more complicated, because information that you might have here gets to spread and gets to be used against you. If you negotiate as player here, the red ones with the stripes here, with this player, the information can get used when this player interacts with that player. And then the competition between you and the player next to you can get a lot more complicated, and you can suffer, right? So the more players in each stage, the more difficult you might have you might have it if you want to interact with that. So this C indicates this line that is different for each player. So different players have different extents to which they outsource. And of course, if that is the case, then this player needs to interact differently with this player here in the first stage than with this player. That really complicates the situation very much for the red player with the lines that are going from the top left to the bottom right, right? So if you have more different players who have different extents of outsourcing, then that simply complicates things a lot. If you have many different stages, now I'm moving to A. If you have many different stages in the supply chain, then at each stage, you need to exchange information about how goods need to be delivered to you, in what truck, for instance, in what crates, and how you then need to further, once you've processed it, you need to deliver the processed foods to the distributor. They have their specific requirements as well. So the more steps, the more information exchange in each between the different steps, and the more complicated. But then again, if you, of course, if you have a very good fit here, and I'm referring to G here, then if there's full overlap between what this party requires, yeah, the green one, and what the blue party requires, then the interaction is one-on-one, and that really facilitates the extent to which you can be expected to do your business without much problems of interacting. But if that is not the case, like here in B, right, you interact, the blue ones interact with the red ones, but the red ones also interact with players here, then that complicates the situation. Another one is here, E. If this player here, say maybe retail, needs to draw information from this player here, say how your apples or your tomatoes, to draw again on Jeff's example, how your tomatoes are being produced, then how does that information from the primary production here of tomatoes, how does the information arrive at the retailer, where the consumers want to see, how many pesticides and herbicides and have been used, and maybe even has there been animal friendly production of pork, whatever. So how does the information flow? Not obvious. And then yeah, so of course, if you are a pretty dominant player here, like in most instances, big supermarket chains can be, or again referring back to what Jeff's saying, Monsanto Bayer might be a dominant player. If you are a dominant player, then you can impose how information needs to be exchanged between stages in the supply chain, or you can impose the extent to which players outsource activities. Oh yeah, I see that I need to change the picture. Ongoing insights. I think it's done here already. Yeah, I've done it here, but then I didn't copy it here. All right, I'll make that change. And then of course you can, as a company here, the blue ones, work very closely together with maybe have an alliance or a joint venture with a company there, but the alignment isn't perfect yet, and yet there needs to be exchange of information in order to make this alliance work properly. So that is something that is yet to be accomplished. So this is maybe highly conceptual, maybe maybe I throw you in the deep, or I throw myself in the deep, or with my co-authors along with us. But I hope that if I can talk a little bit about very concrete companies that have been studied in the IOF 2020 project, that's Internet of Food or Farm, with very nice pictures produced by Flatland artists. I think it makes it hopefully a little bit clearer how, what extent we should talk about agri-food, and to what extent the use of information, no, I should say data, generated at each stage and then transformed into something else that is to be used in the next stage of production in the supply chain. Hopefully it makes it a little bit more clear. So here you have a situation, a picture that focuses mostly on the primary stage of production, where you see vineyards producing grapes, of course. And you see that there's a lot of information being gathered about the grapes, but also the soil and the plants and the temperature and the weather conditions. So you can see what the weather is like, and if the weather turns cold, then you can spray the vineyard with fog, so that there's ice actually protecting the plants from the frost, from the cold air. This camera is moving around, seeing if a plant is in shape, if it needs extra maybe extra nutrients, if it is infected by some kind of pest, then you can target that plant and not all of the plants in the vineyards. You can see what the weather is doing as well, and then you move on to picking, perhaps even in an automated fashion, the processing, the pressing, the fermentation. You can, because you know more about what the quality of the grapes was, you can also be much more specific about how you process the grapes and use less artificial additives to the food. You can be more specific about aging.
Wolfred,
yeah,
Wolfred, you'll have to start wrapping up, please.
Yeah, I'm almost there actually. So this focuses a little bit more on the processing. I think you all get basically the idea about how having information about from one stage of production of food can be used in the next stage. And the final stage, consumers also want to use, know about how exactly their food is being produced, because most people are very well aware that what they eat enters their body, so it has high symbolic value, and I don't think that there's an industry that's more highly regulated than the agri-food industry. Maybe not in the US, but certainly in the EU. And so people are very well aware. But of course, if you don't have a lot of money, then and if you are tricked by the behavioral situation, where that also is fed into by of course agri-food, then you may not be you may always be inclined to go to biofoods. So wrapping it up, Lynn, thanks. So I think it's good to look at the supply chain to not just as a system whereby goods move from one stage to the next, and there's no strategizing, there's no institutional aspect going on. I think we need to go beyond that, if only because we know that information is fundamentally institutionalized, and that actually allows for strategic behavior. And I think if we do that, hopefully we can arrive at a situation whereby agri-food industry shouldn't be as rightfully demonized as Jeff did, but can actually, in a very sportive manner, make sure that, and also sustainable manner, make sure that we feed the many billion people that are living in the world, and mostly are living in urban areas where the kinds of small scale initiatives are not easy to develop. So I'm making a point about sustainability, but also a conceptual point about how to look at supply chains. And I hope we will have some nice discussions relating to different papers. And now I need to stop sharing, but how do I do that? Oh yeah, stop share. Yeah.
Thanks, Wolfert. Thank you.
Florence, the next one.
And let's just remind also those attending, please place some questions in the Q&A, which will come to after the final presentation. Moving right along, our fourth presentation. I think Jan's going to present it on behalf of her and her colleagues. Over to you, Jan.
Yeah, so I'll be presenting the first half. So thanks, Lynn, and good day to everybody. So on behalf of Megan and Erdogan, I'll be introducing the paper, providing the antitrust background, and then tossing it to Erdogan. Okay, here we go. So the argument in brief, I guess, it's been well established that real wages for American workers have been stagnant or even declining for 4 decades. This phenomenon has typically been attributed to such factors as declining union representation, outsourcing and globalization, and federal policies tilted toward the affluent. Today, we offer evidence on a less examined component that would be the rising levels of industrial concentration in the US, which have led to higher prices, higher profits, and a decline in business investment. We will connect these phenomena to the rise of the Chicago School of Antitrust and its more lenient treatment of large firms that parallels the decline in the labor share for workers. So I'll begin with a very brief overview of the emergence of the Chicago School of Antitrust. Then Erdogan will present our empirical analysis of the US manufacturing sector and components of the profit rate to provide evidence for the rising profit shares and slower capital accumulation in the highly concentrated sectors of US manufacturing. Through analysis of this data, we will show that the laissez-faire bent of the Chicago School of Antitrust should be recognized as another strong contributor to rising US inequality. So first I'll give you a very brief history of US antitrust, in other words, 130 years in about 3 minutes. Antitrust came to legal fruition with the Sherman Act in 1890, which was intentionally written as a broad anti-monopoly statute, followed by Clayton and FTC in 1914. During this period, however, both early court cases and many economists showcase differences over the benefits and cost of large firms with market power. While recognizing cost savings and market expansion as good for consumers, there were concerns about the rising economic and political power embodied in these firms. In part, for these reasons, antitrust policy and theory remained somewhat dormant through the 1920s. But following the second great merger wave of the 1920s and the Great Depression, activist antitrust revved up under FDR's brains trusters. Subsequently, with the rise of the Harvard School of Antitrust and its structure conduct performance paradigm, thanks to Joe Bain and Edward Mason, a theoretical and policy consensus more or less emerged that market power presented harms to consumers and to the larger economy. William Shepard concluded in his 1982 Restat article that activist antitrust had indeed made the US economy more competitive. But concerns about activist antitrust subsequently brought the Chicago School of Antitrust to prominence in the later 1970s. In theoretical circles, the Chicago School attributed market power to superior efficiency. Accordingly, in policy circles, the Chicago School promulgated the notion that antitrust enforcement did more harm than good by interfering in market processes. Judges and economists alike made the Chicago School a cornerstone of modern antitrust, beginning then in the later 1970s, introducing into legal treatment, and here I quote Walter Adams and James Brock, a preference for liberty of contract and the ideal of competition free from government power. So the result can be seen in today's increased levels of industrial concentration. And here we list just some of the key studies. Several studies have now documented the US economy now has a market power problem. Just to highlight in particular, Gruan et al.'s findings that 75% of US industries have seen an increase in concentration levels, and Thomas Philippon's conclusion that laxer antitrust scrutiny and, quoting him, excessive tolerance have all contributed to this increase. So before Erdogan presents our findings, let me just note a few studies that have identified the consequences of this rise in industrial concentration, rising economic rents and profits, rising price markups, declining business investment, but a decline. So have they shared these gains with workers? And we will be arguing no here. Many studies have pointed out already a decline in the labor share, a decline in worker productivity and compensation, the use of labor replacing technologies. And then, and I love this phrase, a transition to more use of downsize and distribute. And what that means is to shareholders, not to workers, rather than retaining and reinvesting. So, as I say, kind of a whirlwind introduction to what's been happening, and now to Erdogan.
You're muted, Erdogan.
You can stop sharing, Jen. I can.
Oh, you want to? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so we basically looked at the profit rate and the components of the profit rate, and our focus is going to be on the components of the profit rate in the manufacturing, and to see how these two ratios change among the U.S. manufacturing sector depending on their concentration ratios. And the reason why we use the manufacturing, because mainly of the data availability, we had more complete data for the US manufacturing sector for the period of 1958, 2011. But it's not that all the data were available from the same sources, same source. I'm going to show that in a minute. But before I do that, this is basically the profit rate formula that we used. The one shortcoming of the data is that the data is only available for the payroll, and we don't have the data for the compensation. Therefore, we define the profit as non-payroll income. But it more or less showed the same trend as the one that we see in the non-financial corporation. So in that regard, the analysis, I think, is still holding very well. Okay, so the data comes from the MBER for the period of 1958 and 2011. But we also need the capital stock data, and the capital stock data is only available from Bureau of Economic Analysis. Therefore, we made the two data sets compatible with each other by aggregating the US manufacturing sector, which is available at 6 digits from the MBER. So that basically gave us
one US manufacturing subsectors. Then we used basically this data code from Philippon and Gutierrez to obtain the concentration ratio, which are also obtained from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Then we mapped everything to any AIC as 3-digit sectors. Before we look at the subsectors of the US manufacturing sector and how those two ratios are actually, how those the trends in those two ratios in the US manufacturing subsectors, I'm going to talk about the US manufacturing sector as an aggregate one sector, and see how the profit rate and the components of the profit rate are changing there. So this is the profit rate in the US manufacturing, and it had a long-term decline starting in the mid-1960s, which lasted until the early 1980s. Then there's a recovery in the profit rate up until the late 1990s. And then it started to decline again after early 2001. So this trend in the profit rate is quite similar to the trend in the profit rate in the non-financial corporations. And it is also quite similar to the private sector entirely, which actually we did in other studies. Now, our focus is on the components of the profit rate. So these are the two components of the profit rate I showed earlier: the non-payroll income share and the output capital ratio. And this is quite interesting. And this is indexed to 1958. And since 1958, basically the non-payroll income share has been increasing. And in 2011, it is almost 60% higher than what it was in the 1958. And the output capital ratio, which is sort of an indicator for the long-term trend in the technology, in a way, efficiency, and it has shown a secular decline since 1958, and it is almost 35% below where it was in 1958. Now, so those are interesting, and another interesting aspect, and this is sort of the stylized fact of neoliberalism, where we see actual stagnation in the capital accumulation, despite the fact that partial recovery in the profit rate in the United States. And as you see, the capital accumulation is basically the rate of change in the capital stock. The profit rates recovered partially since the early 1980s, but the capital accumulation has been stagnant since the 1980s, and it has been declining. After a brief period of recovery in the second half of 1990s due to the tech bubble, it started to decrease again, and it is, by any definition, miserable. You can look at, in another way, sort of the share of the investment in non-payroll income. The better indicator would be the share of investment in profit, but since we don't have the data for the benefits, we use the non-payroll income. So you see it was more or less stable up until early 1980s. And then it started to decline significantly. And this is sort of in line with the story about the neoliberalism, where the profit share has been increasing, but nevertheless, the capital accumulation hasn't kept up with the increase in the profit share at all. In fact, it has been declining somewhat significantly since early 1980s. Now, so how these things change depending on the concentration ratios of the subsectors of the manufacturing sectors. And here on the horizontal axis, we rank the sectors depending on their concentration ratios from the highly concentrated sectors to the least concentrated sectors. And as you see, and this is for the CR4. CR4 basically the market share of the top 4 firm in each industry. But we did the same analysis for CR20, CR8, CR50. We also used the HHI index, and for all sorts of concentration ratios, all these trends are holding. So the highly concentrated sectors have higher profit share than the least concentrated sectors, and the least concentrated sectors have somewhat substantially higher output capital ratio than the highly concentrated sectors. And that was for the years before 2002, and between 2002 and 2006, you see the same trend. The reason why we use this 3 years period, because the concentration ratios are only available for 13 years. And then we fill the gap basically with the same concentration ratios. So you have these 3 time periods that I'm going to show. And again, the same thing, the highly concentrated sectors have higher profit share, non-payroll income share, and they have a lower output capital ratio. And the least concentrated sectors have lower profit share and higher output capital ratio. And this is for the last period, 2007 and 2011. Okay. So from these 3 figures, basically you see the highly concentrated sectors have substantially higher profit non-payroll income share, while they also have somewhat substantially lower output capital ratio. Now, in terms of the capital accumulation, you see a similar trend. This chart is sort of difficult to read, but I'm going to just look at, for example, the 1997-2001. And this is the capital accumulation, and this dotted line is for the 1997 and 2001. And as you see, of course, you have always the exceptions.
1 minute.
Yeah,
1 minute.
I'm finishing. So you see the least concentrated sectors have, on average, have higher capital accumulation rate than the highly concentrated sectors. And that's also true for 2002, 2006, and 2007, which is right after the crisis, doesn't show the similar trend, but that is mainly because of the impact of the crisis. Okay, you can finish, Jen, with this.
Sure. So I guess just to very briefly conclude, I mean, we've shown the outcome of the mostly unchecked growth of corporate power, and just to throw a couple little pithy quotes in there, it's just not the case anymore that what's good for GM and any of these other big firms is necessarily good for America. You know, it's impacting workers, livelihoods, as well as, I think, our democratic lives. And I wanted just to close with this quote that we pulled from David Leonhardt from a couple of years ago, where quoting Justice Louis Brandeis, "We may have democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both." And right now we're seeing, I think, some of the impact of that. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Great quote to end on, I think. Great quote. Thank you very much. And our final presentation. Bob, thanks for being so patient. Bob's going to talk about using regulation and rate design to control the electric utility industry and promote a sustainable future. And just a reminder to all of those attending this session, please post your questions in the Q&A. Okay, thanks, Bob.
Well, thank you for allowing me to participate. I'm a non-academic. I am an economic consultant. All my clients are either public advocates or state attorney generals, and I represent them in public utility cases. So anyhow, that's my background. It's sort of different than all of yours. I'm going to set the stage of the discussion by first giving you some background as to what's been happening with the electric generation mix, the capacity mix in the economy. We're still almost complete, we're not completely dominated, but the mix is dominated by the fossil fuel industries, okay? renewables are growing. Solar is mostly in California and Hawaii. We have a lot of wind starting from Texas, Oklahoma, and then, northward from there in the Plain States. But those two output generating capacities are very small. Then I'm going to go and talk about the operations of the PGM capacity market, because it's a large market that affects our future capacity. In the US, the capacity markets are regulated by the federal government. The federal government uses regional transmission organizations such as the PGM to implement policy and run wholesale markets. Of course, some people believe that PGM uses the federal government to implement the policies that are favorable to the stakeholders of the PGM. But no matter which way you see that causation going, you're still going to, the goal of PGM is to have some kind of what they consider to be economic efficiencies in their markets. And that efficiency is very much a private efficiency. They completely ignore the social cost of climate change, which leads them into a tension with the state policies, because states are starting to do something about climate change. They have what's known as renewable portfolio standards, and these require retail suppliers of electricity to have a certain amount of renewables in their portfolio, in which they then resell. The federal regulators view the state policies as subsidies that are interfering with what's happening in an efficient market. And then the third section is about net metering, which is a device which the states use to try to provide an incentive for people to put rooftop solar on their houses. And the utilities, for the most part, believe that that is creating a subsidy. Okay. So anyhow, what's happened over the last so many years, from 2001 to 2019, is that natural gas has really replaced coal as the leading fuel source. But the combined natural gas and coal has only dropped from 69 to 67% of our generating capacity. Okay, starting at very small bases, solar and wind have grown, and there's been a minor shift towards solar. Okay, now in this graph, what's happening is that each technology has two columns. This is the technology as column of 2001. This is that technology in 2019. The first two are coal, so you see there's been a reduction in coal. This next shows you how much, this is natural gas combined cycle. This shows you how much growth, that's been a major growth area in the United States over these years. Combined cycle and natural gas plants have taken over the major load of US production. The next two are natural gas peakers. There's been a little bit of increase there. There's also been a conversion of oil peakers into natural gas. So that's increased, but only a little bit. Here's nuclear, that's almost no change. Here you see solar, almost non-existent in 2001, and it's grown, but it's still very small. This next two are wind, which shows you that their growth, that's been the largest growth of a renewable is wind, but is still small compared to gas production. This is hydro, and that's been relatively constant. And the final two, which for some reason I can't seem to see them all the way this is doing, is all other, and that includes everything else from biofuel to geothermal. It's reduced a little bit, mainly because a lot of oil plants have been retired recently. Okay, the next step is to see, what's happening in the future. And you see natural gas is growing, but also we are seeing a lot of growth in the renewables. This is solar and this is wind. There's a little bit of, this is also natural gas. There's a little bit of nuke, but even that I don't believe is going to happen. These were proposals, and this was for small modular nukes, and I don't think they're going to be built. But even with all of this supposedly increase in solar and wind, these are proposed, we still are going to have 60% of our mix will still be fossil fuel by, let's say, 2024. So even with these proposals and with the sharp increase in the renewables, it's not having a major effect in the total mix. Okay, so then how is these organizations like the PGM wholesale capacity market working, and what is its basics? And what they try to do is to ensure reliability for the future. They're a market in which they're trying to get capacity to be allowed and capacity to be available for a 3-year period in the future. What is very important to understand is that the demand curve that they use is completely artificial, administratively generated. It is their production. So the price point is something determined by what's known as net cone, where cone is the cost of new entry. It's essentially the mortgage payment associated with a new power plant. It is net because what you do is that the power plant can earn profits in the selling electricity. So you subtract the profits or the rents in the electric market from the capital cost. And that is the demand curve for this market. The supply curve are bids by the different entities that are allowed in, and we're going to talk about who is and who is not allowed in. The next important thing to note is that the quantity is again administratively determined. The quantity is the forecasted demand by the RTO plus a reliability standard. And in the PGM, the reliability standard is a reserve margin of 16%. So then the PGM picks out these 3 points and draws the demand curve, just like that. It's just administratively constructed. And then the players bid in and their bids, and then the intersection is down here. And one thing to note is that the market has generally been clearing for about $130 per megawatt day, but the net cone, what the PGM is saying should be the cost of entry, is somewhere around $300, which leads me to be very skeptical that they've got the net cone right, because if that's what it really costs to get in is 300 and people are bidding at 130, that sort of means that a lot of people are irrational. So I don't really think that's true. And I sort of believe that the net cone they started with is way too high. Okay, so what are the results of these capacity markets? What's been happening? Well, the first thing that's been happening is that the percent of the total payment going to electric companies has increased, the capacity has increased and the energy has decreased. The next thing is that there's an excessive amount of capacity. And that's because the peak demand is always being overestimated. Okay, now, yes, forecasts are never accurate, and they're always a little bit off one way or the other, but why are they always 9% too high? I mean, that's a little ridiculous. They should be a little high, a little low, but they're always 9% too high. And the net cone, as I've just been talking about, has always been overestimated because it's based upon outdated technologies. And the last thing that's been coming out of these markets is that the capacity payments are going almost entirely to fossil fuel resources and very little to support renewable energies. So here you have what's happening in the marketplace. The top line is the wholesale price of electricity. It's going down simply because the natural gas price in the United States is going down, and that's influencing the price of electricity, the energy price of electricity. Okay? The bottom 2 lines are transmission and capacity payments, and they are slowly rising so that capacity is getting to be a larger portion of the total. Okay, so that's the first thing that's happening. The second thing that's happening here is that here's where I'm talking about whether or not the PGM is effective from the point of view of, is it economically efficient? The standard for the efficiency would be, you should be able to hit your reliability reserve margin, because that's your goal, is to provide reliable service. Well, what's clearing the market, okay, is these amounts. And you see, they're always substantially over the goal. And this is using the forecast at the date of the auction. So it's like, so you have that going on. So here's the excess percentage. As you see, the excess percentages are average around 8%, which means they're buying about 10 gigawatts more than they need, okay? So if this was an efficient market, we would expect that the first two columns would be relatively close. Sometimes they would be above and below, that this would either be positive or negative and relatively close to zero. But then the last column indicates what's the reserve margin when you're in the year before delivery. This is the reserve margin 3 years before delivery. This is the reserve margin at the end, right before delivery. And you see it's blossoming because the forecast is going down because they realize that they've over forecasted. Okay, so that's what they're getting. And then here's who gets the money. As you see, all these coal plants are getting a lot of money. The new natural gas plants are also getting a lot of money. Hydro is getting a little bit. Existing nuclear is getting money. And down here is the solar and wind. Okay, they're getting almost nothing out of that. 5 minutes left, okay.
Yep.
Then we go to, well, what could possibly be the reasons? And, you know, maybe there isn't any wind or solar, but let me get into some details of these. Here's the capacity factor. Well, that's because, what it says is if you invest 100 megawatt plant, you only get to put a 26 megawatts into the capacity market. Okay, so that's because the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow all the time. But really, what I want to get, let me skip a couple of these and get to where the conflict between the states and the feds are. The feds have gotten a new rule called the minimum offer price rule. Okay, this rule said that for those people investing, entering into the capacity market, they couldn't just put in any price that they wanted to. They had to use certain prices, okay? And each technology had its own minimum price set up. So let's go to this next slide. Let's say you're a nuclear power plant and you have an avoided cost or a net cost. If you are subsidized by the state for being a zero emission provider, then you have to bid 1,570 into the market. You'll never win a contract in that market. You'll always be kicked out. Okay, a coal plant, they can bid their avoided cost standard, and at $10, they'll always get into the market. This solar and the wind, they have to be adjusted up. They're almost never getting into the market because you see how high they are, okay? So it's sort of set up to make sure that the existing people win and the new players, the renewables, lose. Okay, what's going to be the outcome? Okay, you're going to have to buy two sets of capacity, one to meet the renewable energy standards of the state and one to win these bids. Okay, who's going to lose? Well, what's going to be the outcome? Okay, you're going to have to build the 34 gigawatts to meet the renewable energy standards, but there's a good chance that none of that will ever get into the capacity markets. There's approximately 7 gigawatts of subsidized nuclear that are going to be kicked out of the capacity markets, and there's another 7 gigawatts of unsubsidized nuclear that might not clear. Okay, so that's showing what's happening there. Then I want to switch quickly to net metering. The first thing I have to tell you, my wife insists that I tell you that our summer, we have a 10 kilowatt solar panel and our summer bills have been 50 cents. I used to pay a $200 summer bill, so I sort of benefit from that metering, okay? And here's how it generally works. Okay, this is a summer day. The red line is my consumption. The blue line is production. Over here in the early morning hours, I'm actually using and I'm not producing. The blue line is my production. When the blue is greater than the red, I'm selling. That indicates the amount that I sell. From the red line down is self-consumption. And then over here in the nighttime, I'm buying again. Okay, so that's what the output is. If I use the utilities avoided cost standard, I would be paying $54 a month. If I use net metering, I'd only be paying $8 a month. So you can see how the arguments going back and forth show that you know, there's a lot of incentive that would be destroyed for people putting on solar panels if we had to go with the utilities arguments. Okay, and then finally, just my conclusions is that we should establish a regulatory system that really looks at the goal of higher efficiency and expands the focus of efficiency to sustainable future and livable Earth. The capacity markets should be regulated so that they support the state resource plans and not penalize them. And retail rates should encourage installation of renewable generation. And what I mean by proper cost assignment, that has to do with the value of solar and the fact that an individual who has solar panels really doesn't purchase that much during the peak time period, which is when the cost of electricity is very high. That's when they sell, and they purchase in the off-peak times, which is when electricity is relatively cheap. And using that kind of assignment, net metering and cost assignment will probably give the same result, and the people with the solar panels are not being subsidized. So thank you.
Thanks, Bob. I think we've had a pretty amazing set of 5 papers that have fitted very well under the title of corporate power and regulation, which sometimes is a bit of a fluke for a session at a conference as big as this. We'll now be able to open it up for discussion with those attending. There is one question in the Q&A, which is for Ricardo. Can we say that Alibaba is a kind of successful China's government commercial and social project? Ricardo, you need to take your mute off.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think this is very good. And I would say that this is 50-50 because if in my way of interpretation, I would say that this is a kind of the success of the government's public planning, because the government in the beginning dates back to what I've just mentioned in around 1998, 1999, the government would like to encourage the highly educated community to start their own business. And then from the evolution process, actually, a very talented person, this is what I mentioned about the founder of the Alibaba with the entrepreneurship, which is what we understand about the founder of the Alibaba, who are able to carry out very good entrepreneurship and then also form a very effective technostructure for Alibaba. And then this is actually not what the Chinese government from the beginning aimed for. So that in this case, the government, after it plans for, after a stage of the economic reform from the first 2 decades, then this comes to the stage that the government need to realize, also expand on the private corporation, so that in this process, one of few corporations, also including some other big names we know, the Tencent and other corporations being evolved. And then, however, whether this is actually succeed, we can see that just in the past few months, the Alibaba actually going through its end financial groups actually could be doing something not actually fit for the government's long-term planning. for the public planning, so that the government also take the actions to narrow down the gaps between the private planning and the public planning. So that in this case, I would say that from the beginning, the government set up the direction for the public planning for the another stage of the economic reform for the country as a whole. And then Alibaba becomes one of the products or the vehicles being evolved out. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Do we have more questions from the audience, please, for our presenters? Now, I know everyone's been on the Zoom for a couple of hours, and I know what it's like to be on the Zoom teaching for hour after hour, but we've still got a few minutes to ask questions and have some discussion.
I have a question for Wilfred, if that's okay.
Yes, of course.
So Wilfred, I actually am not anti-technology. What bothers me is how technology has been applied or what it's applied in the service of, especially in the US food industry. So I just wondered, I love the supply chain analysis. It strikes me if we wanted to move to both a sustainable and nutritious food system, we absolutely need technology. In fact, growing food a traditional old-fashioned way is backbreaking work. So nobody's developing that kind of technology, right? There's no effort being made, none at all, into transforming our food system in that direction. I just was curious if you had some thoughts, given your supply chain analysis, on how you might actually reorient technological development to be in service of the actual needs of the people, instead of the bottom line of a corporation that doesn't really care about nutrition or health or anything.
I'm a bit ambiguous about that. I think we need IT in particular if you want to feed 7.5 billion people and growing. And there's actually quite a bit of initiative on that. So the pictures I showed are a picture of 3 actually existing companies and their position in the supply chain. So there's a lot of things going on: use of drones, use of all kinds of sensor technologies. There's a lot of stuff going on. I mean, you can have a pig factory, with thousands of pigs, and each pig is individually identified, and you can know what they eat and what they how healthy they are. So what additional things they might need. So there's a lot of things going on already. We need more. And one of the questions that is underpinning the paper is, why are we not seeing more of it? And I think the supply chain picture as information exchange might help out on that a little bit. But so I started saying I'm a bit ambiguous about it, because the point is there's a lot of scale economies involved in this, and so the bigger players will come out best, will come out on top, and that might be Bayer, and they may have changed their ways. Who knows? I hope so. But there's a lot of investments that are going to be required to make sure that the IT opportunities that are out there are being used, and it's not just about how much money needs to be spent. It's also about the strategic aspects of it. So what data needs to be transformed in what way, so that players elsewhere in the value chain, the supply chain, can make use of it. So it's obviously very complex, but we need IT if we have to feed that world population, and we need to avoid the kind of scandals that you've been referring to.
Thanks, Wolfert. Thanks, Jeff. Jeff, there's a question for you in the chat from Greg Hayden. Do you want to answer that one?
Sure, I'll read the question. I'm not sure if everybody can see it. Greg says, since the agriculture food industry is politically determined, why do you think it's unsustainable? My observation is that it is very sustainable. I was using sustainability in the ecological sense. I think, in terms of the industry itself and its ongoing profitability, it certainly demonstrated that it is sustainable in that sense. But it is certainly, the United States food industry is certainly one of the major contributors to climate change. And in that sense, I don't really see it as sustainable long-term, right? Because it's literally undermining the basis that it will need in the future. It's undermining future soil productivity. It's causing the changes in weather patterns that are undermining food productivity in a lot of cases. So, I think it's financially sustainable. I don't think it is environmentally sustainable. And I think that's one of the major challenges. I mean, a lot of the analysis I looked at actually indicates that we're going to face some serious famines if the industry does not change its production methods and fairly soon. And this is why, the feeding 7.5 billion people is a key question, and it has to involve major changes in what we're doing. The question is what direction those should go in. Just as a side note, it's interesting to me that the health industry is now getting into this. Both of our local hospitals are now prescribing patients healthy food. So they're basically telling patients, you can't keep eating the crap that Americans normally eat. So you got to stop eating fast food and you got to stop eating processed food. And so the farms that I work with, literally part of the prescription of patients is to get a share of vegetables from these local farms I work with so that they can actually start improving their health. So I actually wonder if the health industry is going to start driving some of this.
Might well be. Yeah. And not just in suggestion to people that they should change their habits, but I think there will be increasing mingling of technological spheres, medical knowledge and knowledge of how to grow food. So the interaction of what happens when food enters the body. So that's the medical and the physiological disciplines coming together.
Can I just pick up on that? Because it's something I want to ask Geoff too. You referred, it was quite terrifying, some of that information and statistics that you gave us about how unhealthy we all are. You talked about the conglomerates and the growth of the conglomerates and how the loss of the family farm. And then towards the end, you were starting to talk about alternatives. And you've mentioned how, say, with the health sector and this recommendation of getting vegetables from local farms and that sort of thing. But how, with even a range of alternatives, do you break the power of the conglomerates? And I'm thinking about Jan's paper as well in terms of your findings. But if we can just start with, how would you break the conglomerates given how embedded they are now?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And the US is completely beholden to corporate interests at this point, as Jan, Erdogan, and Megan pointed out. So, breaking that is sort of the project for the US in the future. I will say that there's interesting political space, and oddly, food has provided me with, I get more interest from students about issues of food than I do about issues of poverty and things like that, because it's something they put in their bodies. And when they find out what the food industry is doing to them, they are outraged. So, I really do see people coming together over food and understanding food as a metaphor for the problems in our modern economic system as a useful organizing principle. And I've brought students further along by studying food than any other topic I've ever taught. So I think therein lies the possibility. If people are made aware of what's happening to their bodies and how companies are literally exploiting that, they get pissed off and they want change. And it doesn't take very long to get them to completely change their behavior. So some of this is thinking politically about what we can organize around to effect the sorts of progressive change that we're interested in achieving.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd add to that, though, you'll need the support of politicians, government, because, I mean, I see, you know, quite progressive solutions being put forward, but on their own, they're not going to be enough. And it's not just sort of unifying and people coming together. It's got to be at scale to actually have some long-term impact.
Or,
Jen,
or
did you
actually
want
pretty local. I mean, if municipalities allow for citizens to grow their own food, even in cities, you know, facilitate that a little bit, then it might seem small, but it adds up, right? We have some projects in my group about you know, urban farming. That's usually small scale, but you know, all these small initiatives facilitated by municipalities can add up and can make a difference.
I understand, Wilfred. I understand what you're saying, but I think it's how much time it's going to take as it adds up. But Jen, did you want to come in and add anything from you three and what you found? Because in a way, and I'm thinking about those conglomerates controlling food production, in a way, I wasn't surprised at your findings, given what's happened over the last 30 to 40 years. So can you just sort of talk through, were you surprised by your findings? And if so, why?
So the findings, well,
the notion, like the lack of reinvestment, the way, you know, profit rates have gone, the declining labour share. I mean, to me, that's sort of a narrative we're becoming quite familiar with. But so I'm wondering if you found anything surprising in your findings.
I mean, so I think Erdogan can speak a little more clearly to the data. I mean, I think for my own sake, I've been putting a lot of this in the context of the social structures of accumulation. And I mean, there was a real hit that corporations took when globalization began. I think there's been a period of recovery in the last 40 years for them, and then a period of them just growing beyond. I mean, I think there's fewer big firms doing really, really well. And one thing we didn't put in the paper, but I thought about this, it's a case almost of oligopsony, which is not a word you can find in the literature, but you know, so I think that explains why workers have so little power to push back. Unfortunately, we don't have data on the retail sector, but maybe Erdogan can talk a little bit about the investment piece.
Jen, Greg Hayden's just popped a question in for you. He says he's a bit lost. Could you?
I can talk to Greg Hayden's question a little bit.
Okay.
And those things are not conflicting. Basically, the data basically shows that the highly concentrated sectors have unusually high profit share compared to the least concentrated sectors. So they are keeping a much bigger percentage of the value added to themselves in the form of profit compared to the least concentrated sectors. And that's not in conflict with what EPI says and what other actually works show in the case of concentration and what that does to the labor share and the capital accumulation. And another aspect of the data that we presented was that the highly concentrated sectors extract a lot more profit than the least concentrated sectors. But on the other hand, they actually invest much less compared to the least concentrated sectors. So their capital accumulation has been somewhat substantially lower than the capital accumulation that we see in the least concentrated sectors. And that also is not in conflict with what EPI says and what other people says in the tradition of the political economy. The basic logic there is, if you dominate the market, you have less incentive to invest, as opposed to what the efficiency theory of the Chicago school says. And so of course the concentration is only one aspect of what has been going on during the neoliberal period. The other aspect is the declining labor unions and the labor losing bargaining power vis-a-vis capital. And all those things together basically create what we talk about in the form of declining labor shares, increasing inequality measured by the productivity, real wage differential. I don't think any of those things were actually in conflict with what EPI says. But
all right, okay, that's good. Look, we've got just a couple of minutes remaining. Can I just direct a comment and perhaps a question to Bob? I was a little bit intrigued towards the end. This is personal interest stuff about solar panels. We've done something similar at home, but what the regulators are doing and the electricity retailers are doing here in Australia is they're reducing our feed-in tariffs. So we're selling a lot into the grid and they keep reducing the amount of the feed-in tariff. So we're pretty self-sufficient. But the regulators are also proposing to charge prosumers to feed back into the grid. So in other words, we would have to pay for the privilege of selling back in. Is there anything similar like that happening in the US?
No, not to sell back in. What they're trying to do in the US is to raise the fixed charge on the consumer, so that you would pay, like, instead of paying $8 plus a kilowatt hour charge, you would pay like a $30 plus a kilowatt hour charge, or even higher. That's been the strategy in the US. Paying back in, the way you're saying, would be like, well, actually, I've thought about doing that, but make it as a percent of the fossil fuel input of what's coming in. So that if a generator is selling to you and they have a high percent fossil fuel, they would pay a higher rate. You selling in, solar, you would pay almost nothing for selling in. And in that way, we would get around the problem of people being afraid of carbon taxes, because real carbon tax would probably be about 10 to 15 cents a kilowatt hour, and nobody's willing to pay that, right? And if a regulator suggested it, the governor would call up and ask for the person to resign. So,
I mean, the energy debate in Australia, though, is laced with a lot of scaremongering about renewables are unstable, because we've got these very centralised grids that cover most of the mainland on the East Coast. So it's all about they're unstable, we'll have interruption to supply. So look, there's a lot of scaremongering going on about it, but I was just a bit interested to know what was happening in the States.
We're going to be kicked out in 2 minutes.
Okay, the instability can be solved by batteries, and battery costs are dropping really fast. Not only solar panels costs dropping fast, but batteries are dropping fast. And
well, I think we probably better wrap up because we'll get cut off pretty quickly. I think this was a fabulous session of 5 fabulous presentations that fitted really, really well together. I hope they're all going to be written up and published in JEI or more. So thank you very much for all these fabulous presentations, and thank you very much to all our attendees. I know it's a little frustrating, we can't see you, and you can see and hear us, and look forward to seeing you at the Veblen Commons Award speech in about 15 minutes time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn, for chairing. Thank you, Lynn, for chairing.
Thanks,
Thank
Lynn.
you. Bye.
Bye.
And Megan, nice to meet you, even though it was only virtual.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye.